going to discuss what makes a patient eligible for a manual wheelchair. So we just broke it down into three basic categories. We have the manual chairs, the K5, you have your manual tilt and space, that's basically independent versus dependent mobility, and then you're going to have your motorized wheelchairs. So let's first focus on the manual wheelchair eligibility. So a patient, again, as we said many times already, this is all about providing safe mobility for beneficiaries for in-home use in regard to MRADLs, which is mobility-related activities of daily living. So a patient who is unable to maintain safe mobility with a cane or walker would qualify for a manual wheelchair. For example, a patient's a high fall risk, inability to initiate gait, they may be a more severe diagnosis as in paraplegic, they're amputees, or any other reason in between as to why the patient is not safe ambulating. When it comes to manual wheelchairs, there are two types of wheelchairs. There's a dependent mobility and an independent mobility. Dependent means somebody's going to be pushing the patient. The patient requires to have a caregiver available to push them in the wheelchair. Independent mobility means the patient themselves will have that independence of being able to self-propel themselves in a manual wheelchair. So when it comes to manual wheelchairs, we start off with our K0001 or K1. This is your basic, off-the-shelf, dependent wheelchair. There's nothing fancy about the chair, but it's a heavier wheelchair, and therefore it's really designed for a patient who is not able to self-propel themselves. They don't have enough of an upper body strength or lower body strength. Now, again, when it comes to self-propelling, some patients are going to use their hands and they can propel with their hands. They'll push the wheels. Some patients will use their feet to propel along with their feet, and some will use both. But your K1 patient is a patient who doesn't have the strength or the endurance to self-propel themselves, and they're obviously not a candidate for a power chair. It doesn't work for them. It could be multitude of reasons. Then the chair that's a little lighter is a patient who can get a K3, which is for a self-propelling lightweight wheelchair. Then it gets a little lighter than that as a K4. The differences between K3 and K4 are minimal. Some insurances give out K4s, some give out K3s. You can get, let's say, a contoured back on a K4, but I don't really want to focus on that. That is basically K1 through K4 is manual wheelchair, off the shelf, either independent or dependent. Again, the eligibility and qualification is the patient is unable to get around their home. They cannot use a cane or a walker. They're non-ambulatory, or they're not safe ambulating, or they're non-functional ambulating. Sometimes you'll have a patient, the therapist can say, well, my patient can take a few steps. I want them to keep working on their strength. That's great. They should work on their strength. Is that going to be a functional level of mobility? When the therapist leaves the home, will the patient be able to get from their bedroom to their kitchen for meals? If the answer is yes with the cane, then give them a cane. If the answer is no, let's look at a wheelchair. When it comes to the K5, that's where we come in. That is the custom ultra lightweight manual wheelchair. Now there are two types of custom ultra lightweight manual wheelchairs. There's the folding frame and a rigid frame. As you've hopefully seen already in the previous clips and brochures, you'll see there are two types of wheelchairs. One folds down the middle, one the back folds down, but it's more of a rigid frame. The seat doesn't collapse. The funding and eligibility for these chairs are exactly the same. It boils down to a patient's preference, what their goals are, how they get around the community, how do they transfer, what sort of chair do they want. They need a small difference is that the folding frame may be a pound or two heavier than the rigid frame because they need an extra bar for the cross brace. Well, the main idea of an ultra lightweight manual wheelchair would be that the chair is actually lighter than the other wheelchairs. The justification and qualification for this chair is not based on the actual weight. Although it's important when justifying a chair and recommending a chair like this to explain to the insurance that the patient is a highly active patient, you want to give examples of what they do and why they need to have a lighter wheelchair to preserve their energy. The reason why we're going to get qualified and authorized for this sort of chair is not going to be based on the weight. The reason for this is that Medicare has basically said it is almost impossible to properly document a patient's ability to self-propel a wheelchair that's a K4 versus a K5. That 5-pound difference in weight If you have a patient, just to give you some understanding, if you have a patient that weighs 180, 200 pounds and they're propelling a chair of 30 pounds or 25 pounds, it's very hard to make the case that the patient was independent the entire day with a 25-pound wheelchair and they could not get around properly with a 30-pound wheelchair. It's not that it's not possible, but to make that case and essentially prove it, the necessity for that 5 pounds difference when the patient's own weight can fluctuate like that, the insurance has basically said, we're never going to prove it to them. However, as the chairs get lighter, there are different aspects on the chair and specifications on the chair that you can configure for your patient that are not available on a heavier wheelchair. For example, ultra lightweight manual wheelchairs have a feature that's called an adjustable axle plate. Now, you may have seen this in the previous videos already. What that means is that the wheels, instead of being positioned in an axle basically behind the patient, because if you can picture the patient sitting in the wheelchair, then the back canes from their chair go down behind their back, and that back cane is the receiver for the axle of the manual wheelchair. So the patient is already sitting in front of the bend down of the wheel. So for a patient sitting in a regular K1 through K4, in order to access the wheels, they need to have good range of motion in their shoulders and good core strength to maintain their posture upright, pick up both their hands and kind of pull back and push that wheelchair. Now, it's any patient with good strength, obviously using your shoulders like that a lot is dangerous. They can wear them out, but we need to focus on the necessity, not just the benefit, but a necessity. So what we do with these ultra lightweight wheelchairs is we can move those wheels 1, 2, or even 3 inches forward. What that does is that provides the patient with much better access to the wheels to self-propel, and essentially they're using their forearms instead of their shoulders. Now, using your forearms to self-propel is a much more efficient and energy-saving way to self-propel. However, so even though everybody's going to benefit from having an adjustable axle plate and moving the wheels forward so they can access the wheels with their forearms and kind of propel with their arms instead of their shoulders, we need to prove necessity. The patient needs to have the wheel move forward in order for us to justify and qualify the patient for this chair. How do we do that? There are 2 main reasons why a patient would need to have the wheel move forward. Number 1 would be they have a limited range of motion in their shoulders. A patient who has rotator cuff or any sort of tightness or tone or any sort of active limited range of motion in their shoulder, that they're unable to reach back to the wheel to self-propel, unable to access the wheel to self-propel, and require the wheel to be moved forward to accommodate their limited range of motion, that would qualify them for the ultra lightweight wheelchair. Again, the patient needs to be a highly active patient. We need to describe some of the patient's activities that they do, even though it could be out of the home. We need to describe the patient goes to social settings, they go to movies, they go to restaurants, they go to doctor's appointments. Medicare does want to know about the patient and why they are highly active. However, the primary qualification and justification will be the patient requires an ultra lightweight manual wheelchair with an adjustable axle plate set at 2 inches center of gravity, 1.5 inches center of gravity, so therefore the patient can access the wheels. The patient has limited range of motion and therefore unable to access the wheels, requires the adjustable axle plate. That is the justification for an ultra lightweight wheelchair. So one primary justification would be the inability to reach the wheels because of their limited range of motion. The other justification would be if the patient is unable to maintain their seated posture and reach back for the wheels. What does that mean? If you have a patient with poor trunk control or any sort of inability to lift up both their hands and maintain their posture, they're not going to be able to reach back and grab those wheels. A patient like that, if they can sit up and hold themselves up with their shoulders and just use their forearms to propel, a patient like that would also require an adjustable axle plate, prove the necessity for an adjustable axle plate. So what we're saying basically to the insurance is the patient's unable to use a standard manual wheelchair or lightweight manual wheelchair because they're unable to access the wheels to self-propel. If they have the adjustable axle plate on the chair, they will then be able to access the wheels. They will then be able to be independent in a wheelchair, and that is your justification for your ultra lightweight manual wheelchair.